triangle.
You know, there's explanation for everything that occurred in the Rendlesham Forest incident that doesn't involve aliens at all.
It was completely silent. It comes right over our heads.
He saw a classic flying saucer, really, standing in a clearing.
He turned over to my father and held his hand, and he looked in his eyes, and he said, "We're not alone."
Welcome to Podcast UFO for our live show. We're live every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Please remember to visit the website podcastufo.com for past episodes, blogs, and forums. During the show, feel free to participate live in our chat room. And don't forget to like us on our very active Facebook page.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host. And if you're watching live on YouTube, or on YouTube at all, you can see that I'm in studio with a guest host, Donnie Goslin. How you doing, Donnie?
Doing fine, thanks, Martin.
Donnie has been on a number of times. He's a retired police officer in Boston. And you know what? Alejandro Rojas, that is on with the UFO updates. I have not been able to raise him today, and I hope he's feeling okay. So I'm not sure. I just left him a message to call into the show with UFO news, so hopefully he will be calling in. I don't know about that. So last week, if you missed last week's show, I announced that I'm not going to be doing the live YouTube shows. Shows are still going to be on YouTube, but they are not going to be live on YouTube as far as I know. And that's coming up in 2 weeks on December 13th. Still going to be a live show. We're going to be over at KGRA Radio. That's an internet radio station. Supposed to be a really good fit for this show with a built-in audience. It should do really well, I hope. There's chat rooms over there. And so I hope that the people listening live in YouTube will kind of wander over there. I'll have all that information on podcastufo.com. So you just go to the website and you'll see all the information there. That starts again on the 13th, the regular time slot, 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you can't listen to the show live and you can't support the show, and by the way, thank you, supporters. If you can't support the show, then and you want to listen to the full show, of course, you can come to podcastufo.com, 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, or KGR Radio, that website. That link will be right on my website. You can also listen to it on the Dark Matter Digital Network on Thursday evenings from 10 to midnight. So that's every Thursday on that. That's about it. I'm still waiting for Alejandro. Unfortunately, I don't think he's going to be calling in. So, and I hope he's okay. So we were talking before the show. We'll be bringing... I forgot to talk about our guest, didn't I? Can you believe that? Our guest tonight is Jim MacDonald. And he is not to be confused with the James MacDonald in Arizona, the UFO researcher that had quite the fame years ago. So Jim MacDonald has been looking at the Betty and Barney case for quite a while, Betty and Barney Hill, that is. We're going to be talking about that. He has a different view on that. Now, I do want to say a couple things about that. I am going to remain neutral on that, let him say what he has to say, and ask him questions along. Typically, we take calls in the second hour or about 45 minutes into the show. Because I don't have the UFO updates tonight, we're going to take calls earlier. So if you want to write this down, if you have a question for our guest as he goes along, that number is 603-967-4030. And if you're calling from another country, just add a 1 to that, 603-967-4030. And also, if you want to use Skype, that's fine as well. And the Skype username is Marty Willis. I don't like to be called Marty, but anyway, that was available. Marty Willis, MartyWillis. So I think that's it. And just remember, we have 2 more shows on YouTube. I will be posting on YouTube, and I think I can only do video on my end. I don't think I can do video on the guest's end, so it might be a little bit boring. But anyway, you can check that out, see if we can progress and figure all that stuff out. So our guest, Jim MacDonald, again, he has his own thoughts on what happened back in 1961. He's a former naval officer, and he's also known as a science fiction author. The Mage Worlds series for Tor Books, and he co-wrote them with his wife, Deborah Doyle. He's also a professional magician, and it's funny. I know a number of magicians that are kind of skeptics because they think that everything can be faked or is an illusion. So we can talk a little bit about that. And he's also been an EMT for the last 20 years. So, Jim, welcome to the show.
Hello, Mark. Yeah, hi.
Hi.
How are you?
Okay, I'm not getting your audio.
Hello.
There you are. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Well, here I am.
Here you are. Let's hear a little bit about yourself, and then what got you interested in the Betty and Barney Hill incident in the beginning.
In the beginning, I read about it when it was first being published. I am that old, and I remember, I remember the '60s, which means I wasn't really there. People tell me. So, anyway, eventually I moved to Upper New Hampshire, where I live in Colebrook, and one day back in the mid-'90s, I was standing in my kitchen reading the Union Leader, like you do, and there was a brief story, maybe 2 column inches, about a fellow who had just seen a unidentified flying object in Franconia Notch just the previous week. And I said to myself, Franconia Notch, I remember something about that. And so I looked up the Betty and Barney Hill story. I got a copy of John Fuller's book. And I said to myself, wait a minute. Why are 2 different people seeing the same thing at the same place? What's up with that? And I recalled also, I've driven up and down Route 3 many, many, many times, all hours of the day and night, and all kinds of weather conditions. I said, there is a light that you see. And I followed the story of Betty and Barney in John Fuller's book, and the light on the top of Cannon Mountain matches exactly what they what they reported. It matches exactly the movements of their UFO and which side of the car it passes down and all the rest. I said, maybe, just maybe, this guy in the mid-'90s and Betty and Barney back in '61, they were just seeing a light at night and misidentified it. And that's my thing. And now I don't know what you're going to do with the other hour and 50 minutes.
Hour and 55 minutes.
Yeah. I'm sure it goes a bit deeper than that, because if that was all you had, then you have a lot of different theories on this. And about the light, I understand what you're saying about the light, because I used to live in Colorado, and there was a lot of lights in the mountains there. And it did seem like as you were going along, like the light kept going along, but it was just that it was at a long distance away. So I understand a little bit about that, but why are you convinced that something else happened instead of their entire story? Let's go through the whole thing. First of all, let's talk a little bit about what happened, what their recount was of what happened that night.
Okay. The first important thing to notice is they started that day off in Niagara Falls, and they drove all day. Then they drove all night. And according to Fuller, the reason is because they had no money for a motel. If they'd stopped at a motel, they would have never been abducted by aliens, I'm pretty sure. Because I'm sure you know about drowsy driving, right?
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. It's
a thing. And some of the symptoms of drowsy driving and of sleep deprivation, and remember, by the time Betty and Barney got home, they'd been driving for about 21 straight hours. One of the signs is a feeling of lost time. One of the symptoms is that you can't remember the last several miles you drove. And another one of the symptoms of sleep deprivation is paranoia, the feeling that you're being watched or being followed. And Betty and Barney had all of those things. So combined, nearly, I have no idea how long truckers are allowed to drive straight through. Perhaps your other guest, the police officer, knows that.
It's nowhere near 21 hours. It's quite a bit less, and it's very well supervised, at least at this point in our history.
Logged in books, yeah.
Yep, it has to be.
Yeah, they have to log in where they sleep, how long they're down, how long they're driving. And I'm pretty sure that 21 hours is not inside that ballpark. So we've got the missing time, which is one of the big things. We've got the feeling that they're being followed, feeling they're being watched. That's another sign of sleep deprivation. And we've got the unable to remember the last several miles driven. Another well-publicized, well-known sign of drowsy driving.
Now, is this scientifically, these tests, are, where are you getting this information?
Well, the National Drowsy Driving Organization brochure that I picked up at the town hall about don't drive drowsy, things like that.
Drowsy driving.
Yeah, I'm sure they exist. I don't claim to be any kind of expert on drowsy driving, but I am able to read a brochure from the highway department.
Yeah, I think what Jim is saying has the ring of truth to it, because I've noticed a little bit of something about sleep deprivation, and there are scenarios that are documented where people begin to hallucinate, and people they believe that they see things. For example, Navy SEALs and Green Berets, when they undergo their training, they're intentionally deprived of sleep, and there have been tales of special forces guys or wannabes out lost in the woods, where they see fairies and God only know what else they see out there. But there's a ring of truth, at least to the sleep deprivation part. I think we can agree on that.
Yeah, but there's quite a bit more to the story. So how do you piece the other pieces together?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, well, let's go through this. We have a time tick when they stopped in Colebrook, which is my current hometown, where they're leaving the restaurant at about 10 p.m. and heading down Route 3. Later on, Fuller says that they're approaching Franconia Notch at around 11. This is impossible. This cannot be done. So if they were getting that, approaching the mountains, approaching the Notch around 11, that tells me that their watches had already stopped by that point. So the fact that the next day their watches didn't work, that had already happened long before the UFO even showed up. So,
how long does it normally take from the two stops you're talking about?
Between Colebrook and Franconia Notch, around an hour and a half, and that's with the modern road straightened and leveled.
Right, and with a modern vehicle as well.
With a modern vehicle with modern headlights, as opposed to a 1961 vehicle. I don't know if there's anything you could look up, but if I recall correctly, headlights were a lot dimmer in those days.
Right. It's a 57 Chevy Bel Air, I think they were driving.
So let's get into other parts of this story. And, first of all, it was something that they didn't come out with. They didn't go public with this. Am I right about that?
That's true. I have no idea how it eventually came out. It was after they'd talked with a psychiatrist, if I recall correctly. I believe that Betty and Barney were completely honest, absolutely truthful, good people. I don't believe that they were fibbing or making things up. I believe they're telling us exactly what they remembered. What I don't believe, though, is that what they remembered is what actually happened. So I think that we've got a case of drowsy driving plus misidentification of a common object, which over time and with the hypnotic regression led them to a fantastic story. When a psychiatrist does treatment on a person, they aren't looking for absolute truth. They're looking for the psychological reality rather than the yardstick and stopwatch reality.
Okay.
So
now I remember talking with Kathy Martin, Betty's niece, and she said that there were concentric marks on the back of the vehicle. There was a lot of things, but in details, they had some type of encounter, according to them, and you think this is all, even though they both had great detail about it, you think it's all driven by sleep deprivation. Is that what I'm getting?
Yep, sleep deprivation and misidentification of a common object. We don't know how long those marks had been on the back of the trunk, do we? We don't know if that they were there a week before, and only now that something weird has happened are we looking at the car and, oh my goodness, here's something weird. If I recall correctly, they checked these marks on the trunk of the car by running a magnet, or running a compass by it, and the compass needle deviated, proving that they were radioactive. I don't know how to tell you this, but that doesn't measure radioactivity.
Right.
It measures whether or not the compass was near an iron object, and a 57 Bel Air is pretty darned iron, if I remember correctly.
Right.
Yeah.
But also relate to the magnetic properties of an object as well.
All right. Now, what about? I think there's Project Blue Book.
Yeah.
What about that aspect of it?
Well, way back in the 50s and 60s, and again, I'm not speaking as any kind of expert. I'm not claiming to be any kind of expert. There was a big question about what exactly the Soviet Union was up to. They were supermen who were 10 feet tall and had all kinds of super science. Remember that there was a question of whether or not the Russians were using remote viewing to be able to read secret documents, so the CIA got some telepaths to see if they could do it too, because nobody knew whether it was real or not. So there's strange objects flying around in the sky. Are they Russian super science craft? We've got to check it out. So Blue Book, from the fact that it's got a two-word name, we know it's a classified project. And from the fact that the name has nothing to do with what it's all about, classified project. So I'm sure it's been declassified by now. What did Blue Book have to say about it? Of course the U.S. is going to investigate any report of a flying object because it could be a Russian. This close encounter, Betty and Barney, took place back in 1961. That was between the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Right. The Cold War was about as frosty as it was going to get. Right. So I would think that the Air Force would be remiss if they were not investigating.
Well, I understand that now. So if we're walking all the way through all of this, there's it goes all the way to later on that Betty recalls a star chart. And
okay.
Let's hear what you have to say about that. I mean, that's another.
Okay. You have a bunch of random points, and you've got a huge universe that you can match them with. People who are better qualified than I have said that it only matches if you leave out certain really major features, and that you're making a two-dimensional object map onto some kind of three-dimensional space. I think that the psychiatrist said that we'll know it's true if we get to Zeta Reticuli or wherever, and there is a civilization there. Then we'll know for sure. Until then, unproven. I bet you a nickel that I could throw a handful of seeds onto a piece of paper, mark down where they fell, and map it to somewhere in the universe.
Well, there's no doubt that that's possible given the state of the universe as we know it today. That's a given. It's you could put any type of configuration would represent whatever type of star system or galaxy that exists that we know of in the present time. But the part that gives me the trouble about this, Jim, and I'm coming at this from a police perspective, and I've dealt with hundreds of witnesses in my career, and sometimes all you have really is witness testimony, You don't have physical evidence. You don't really have a lot that corroborates what the witness says. I put people into prison based on witness testimony. But the level of detail that these people provided, it impresses me. And the point I'm trying to get is, when people put together a type of story like that, at that level of detail, either they're just wildly exaggerating what happened, and I tip my hat to them if that's the case, because that's an extraordinary level of detail. But the other part is if they are making this up out of whole cloth, or if they are confabulating, what's the motive?
The psychiatrist was of the opinion that they were confabulating. He's a board-certified psychiatrist who examined them in person. Who am I to say that he was wrong?
But what's the motive? Why would somebody, first of all, expose himself to public ridicule, because sooner or later their identities are going to become known? And I had the same impression when I read Dr. Mack's book, which was, believe me, I'm with you on the skeptic side of this. This gives me problems, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, I don't want to speak for Martin, but he's also skeptic on this as far as I'm aware, on the whole issue of abduction and
the abduction part of. I don't say that I'm.
You're agnostic.
I'm skeptic. I'm more of agnostic. I've been on the fence about it. But I think that there's something to it. Like I do think that there are UFOs. I don't know. I don't pretend to say that I know what they are, and from firsthand experience. And I didn't have sleep deprivation, but. I think it only makes sense that if we are being explored, even if it's not interstellar, somehow we're being explored by something else. A logical thing is to take samples and to test things. So I think it's, that part of the abduction, and there are some abduction stories. I've always thought this was a pretty solid case. There are some other abduction stories that I think are very solid and very interesting. That have no explanation. And, later on in the show, we can talk a little bit about that, what you think about other things, Jim. But for right now, I want to say that if anyone is out there and they want to call in, I'm taking calls early. So you can call. That number is 1-603-967-4030. Callers are welcome to call in. Just make sure that if you're calling in, you have your volume down on what you're listening to the show live. What about the things that happened to them during this supposed abduction, Jim? Other people have said that the similar things have happened. You don't think they're just copycats, do you? I mean, people in, say, other countries. Hold on, Jim. Actually, we have someone calling in right now.
Oh, good.
And caller, can you hear me? Welcome to the show.
Yes, I can hear you.
Hi. Oh, is this Kathy?
Yes, it is.
Hi, Kathy. How are you?
I'm doing well. Who is this?
This is Martin. And welcome to the show. Thanks for calling in. So we have Kathy Martin on the line. Jim, have you ever spoken with her?
I've exchanged some posts on some comments in a blog post.
Yeah. All right. So, hey, Kathy, go ahead. I'd actually like to hear what you have to say to the show. Have you been listening so far? So, what do you have to say with what Jim has talked about so far?
Yes, well, I would like to correct some misinformation with regard to some of the things that Jim said. First of all, he stated that the Hills had started that day in Niagara Falls, and that is false. They had left Niagara Falls the day before that, and they spent the night in a motel 112 miles west of Montreal. So they did have a very good night's sleep. They did the tourist thing in Montreal, and then they started to drive home. They decided that they would stop along the way if they grew tired, but they had a really good night's sleep the night before, so they decided not to stop. And then they had this sighting of the craft that came in closer and closer. Now, A point that I really do want to make is that they described this as appearing to be spinning. It appeared to be lighted on only one side, which gave it a twinkling effect. They said as it glided closer, Barney was able to see inside this object, but not too closely. He did see many figures scurrying about, as though they were making some hurried type of preparation. One figure was observing us, Betty wrote, from the windows. From the distance this was seen, the figures appeared to be about the size of a pencil, thinking of a pencil held at arm's length, and seemed to be dressed in some type of shiny black uniform. This was quoted from the letter that Betty wrote to Donald Kehoe, the head of NICAP, on September 26, 1961. They also made an Air Force Blue Book report, and you were showing that as well. And in the Blue Book report, it stated that this craft had swooped down. And when it swooped down, at first it appeared to be the size of a dinner plate held at arm's length. Imagine this. The full moon can be covered by an aspirin held at arm's length.
Right.
So this was the size of a dinner plate. This was enormous. And this was seen by Betty and Barney when they were south of Franconia Notch in Lincoln, New Hampshire. They were across the street from the Notch Express, which is south of Indian Head, the Indian Head Resort. So this was a very large object, reported to NICAP, reported to the Air Force, and I think that those are two very important points, because that light up on top of Cannon Mountain, which Betty did speak of and was aware that it was there, and described the craft as being very different from that, I think that it is very, very important to consider those things, because you cannot see that light from the position if you're looking north from where Betty and Barney's car was stopped after this object swooped down. And at first was about 200 feet above Barney. Jim can look in The Interrupted Journey, or he can also look in my book with Stanton Friedman, Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience. And there he will see Barney's sketches that he drew when he arrived home. And on those sketches, he wrote, first, this is how it looked when it was about 200 feet in the air. And then on the bottom, this is how it looked when it was about 100 feet in the air. And you can see that he has drawn stick figures behind the windows in those sketches. So I think that these are some very important points that have to be made. Now, the close encounter field was where the object was seen. They arrived at that at about midnight. So that was about 2 hours from Colebrook. And so those are some of the points that I think that really need to be addressed.
Kathy, I just had a quick question for you. You mentioned that they had driven from Montreal about 100, I think your words are 112 miles west of Montreal, where they stayed the night?
Yes.
If they had stayed in Montreal the night previously, then why did they decide to stop and sleep 2 miles outside of Montreal? And if that mileage is correct, that's just over the border from New Hampshire.
No, I think you got that wrong.
Okay, I'm glad you corrected me.
They spent the night of the 18th in Ontario, 112 miles west of Montreal.
Okay, right.
They drove east toward Montreal. They visited Old Montreal. They drove around. They did the sightseeing thing in Montreal. And then from Montreal to Colebrook is 130 miles. They left Colebrook at 10 o'clock at night. And from Colebrook to Lancaster is 35 miles. So from Lancaster to Portsmouth, New Hampshire is 143 miles. My husband and I drove this entire route from Niagara Falls all the way to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in 2 days, just like Betty and Barney did, following the same route that they took in the same time frame and the same month of the year. And we were 20 years older than Betty and Barney when they took that drive. And we were not extremely tired, and we were not hallucinating. So I don't think that Betty and Barney, who were 20 years younger than us when we took that drive, were hallucinating or tired. And certainly they were credible individuals who wanted to do the right thing. They were asked to make a report to Pease Air Force Base, to Project Blue Book. They did that. They followed the instructions that were given to them, and they had a considerable amount of circumstantial and physical evidence when they arrived home.
Jim, you have some questions?
Yeah. Okay. First of all, let's remove everything that's a recovered memory, okay? So I have no idea
what I'm telling you,
they are.
These aren't recovered memories.
Okay. They aren't recovered
Everything
memories.
I've told you is not a recovered memory. It was all conscious, continuous recall.
Okay. Within the few days after the event, cool. Now, at the point where they're standing at the foot of Cannon Mountain, and they see the light at the top of the tramway, and they see above and to the left of that light, they see their UFO. Remember that point?
Yes, they were on the old section of Route 3.
Yep.
There's a bridge, if you go onto the old Hugh Gallen Bridge, where the old Route 3 was. They stopped at the base of the Old Man of the Mountain. They looked up, and they saw an object next to the old man's profile. And that object appeared to be at least 1.5 times to 2 times the length of the old man's profile. It appeared to be spinning.
Okay, but let's move back to the foot of Profile Lake, okay? Foot of Cannon Mountain, Profile Lake. They're looking up at the tramway. They see the lights at the station at the top of the tramway, right? Above and to the left, they see the UFO. Is this correct so far?
To the left, by the old man's profile.
You cannot see the old man's profile from there.
Well, they were looking up at the old man's profile.
Okay, from the old man's profile.
Their location, they could see the old man's profile from where they stopped that night.
Okay. Where was the point where they could see the lights on the tramway?
Well, they would have seen the light when they came in along the Hugh Gallen Bridge and looked straight ahead. I've driven that many times, and you can see that light.
Absolutely can. And
yes, and
okay, you see the light of the tramway. And
yes.
And they saw their UFO above and to the left of the tramway. Is this correct?
As they were driving in, they saw the object pass over the top of the building at the top of the mountain. And then they stopped the car by the Old Man of the Mountain and looked up at the craft as it hovered next to the old man's profile. And then it moved in a stair-step pattern. The pattern was very erratic, they told the Air Force.
Okay. The point I'm trying to get to is that at the point where you could see the tramway lights, top of the tramway, and they saw a UFO above and to the left, what you would have seen, what I would have seen, what anybody else would have seen that same night would have been the lights at the top of the tramway and the aircraft safety light on the top of the watchtower on Cannon Mountain.
Yes, of course the aircraft safety light was there, and Betty said that had been changed over the years, so the light that's there now is different from the one that was there in 1961. She was always aware of that light. But that's really inconsequential because they drove another 8 miles looking at that craft as it moved south, and then Betty was becoming excited because it was moving in closer and closer. This is all part of the conscious continuous recall, where it swooped down over the top of the road And Barney had to stop the car in the middle of the road in order not to be directly underneath that craft.
Okay.
Do you know where the Notch Express gas station and store is?
I do.
Okay. Well, the Close Encounter Field is right across the street from the Notch Express.
Okay.
Route 93 was not there in 1961.
I know, but there's not a lot of room between the sides of the mountains to put another road. 93 at that location is the only interstate in the United States that has 2 lanes.
Right.
So Route 3 and Route 93 are pretty much in the same locations where they were back in 61. Pemigewasset River has not changed its location. And
no, absolutely. But 93 had not been constructed that far north in 1961. It had been...
It got as far as
Tilton. Go ahead.
93 got to Tilton in 61.
Yes, that's correct. I have the map, a 1961 map.
Kathy,
Right.
I have a question for you, and this relates back to Jim's theory or hypothesis that sleep deprivation was involved. Do you know at what time they left their lodging on the 18th in Ontario?
They left their lodging right around 10 o'clock in the morning or a little later. They had slept late that morning. They had a very good night's sleep. They had a big breakfast, and then they drove on to Montreal.
So that's about, let's say that the state of the highways was pretty close to what it is.
It would have been a couple of hours.
Yeah, about a 2-hour drive. So that puts them in Montreal around noontime, and they were in Montreal probably until, at what time would you say?
Oh, probably until 4 or 5 in the afternoon. They were leaving the city when the traffic was picking up. So people were getting out of work.
Right.
And then they drove toward the 112 miles. I mean, the 130 miles from Montreal to Colebrook.
Yeah. So then to get to Colebrook, 10 o'clock, we said. So yes. They took, what, 7 to 8, 8 to 9, 9 to 10, 3 hours to get there. Is that about right?
From Montreal to Colebrook?
Yeah.
Well, they stopped. You have to consider the fact that they stopped at a restaurant. They were sightseeing along the way. They stopped at a really pretty little town along the way. So they were doing the sightseeing thing, which put them in Colebrook at 10 o'clock.
So it took them about 3 hours to get from Montreal to Colebrook. That's not unreasonable because even with Route 10, which is now a superhighway up there in Canada, it still takes you about 2 hours if you're just chugging through to get from Montreal to Colebrook.
Right.
So that's not unreasonable.
Yes, and they were on the old road, of course.
Of course.
My husband and I drove on the old road when we retraced their route.
Yeah, they deliberately took 2-lane blacktop. They didn't take the New York Thruway or anything like this.
That old road goes through it goes through these small towns and you used to have to slow down. So it can take quite a period of time. It's not like it is today. I-10 is a superhighway.
That's correct. It took a while. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. It would have taken a while, and it's tiring to do. It really is.
So,
they were getting out of the car and walking and sightseeing and stopping to eat, doing that sort of thing, too.
Okay, so
it took them about 5 hours, probably.
All right,
of sightseeing to get to Colebrook, and then eat and have their snack and their coffee and leave at 10.
All right. Well, I think this is a good opportunity, Kathy, that you're on, because I'd like to basically ask you, Jim, what you think the weakest part of their story is, and then I want to hear what Kathy's answer is to what you think the weakest part of their story is.
The weakest part of the story is if they saw a UFO, what happened? Where was the Cannon Mountain Light that whole time? That's the weakest part. There's another part, which is that round, glowing orange orb. That sounds an awful lot like the round, glowing orange pumpkin on the top of the Jack-o'-lantern Resort in Lincoln.
And what do you have to say about that, Kathy?
Okay, with regard to, it wasn't just a glowing orb. It was a fiery red-orange orb. He's talking about the orb that they saw that appeared to be sitting on the ground. And they later realized that it was moving, but they were not moving at that point. So they probably did pass the Jack-o'-lantern resort.
They had to. It's on record.
Yes, and I did put that in captured, and I did question why Betty had said something about a jack-o'-lantern head. And I thought, well, maybe she was just remembering the jack-o'-lantern head at the top of the jack-o'-lantern resort. And I asked her about that, and she said, yes, well, that might be. That might be what it was. And then they turned off the road after the jack-o'-lantern resort. They went over a bridge. They turned right. And then, and Barney really, it seems, was not under his own control at that point. He seemed to be controlled by something. He made a very sharp left-hand turn onto Millbrook Road, which was a logging road in that time frame. And on that logging road, it's now a housing development, but it was a small dirt road, and there were those non-humans that he had previously seen through the binoculars as he was standing in the field shortly before that. And they stopped the car, and then they approached the car. They did not remember that part of it. That came out under hypnosis. They did remember turning off Route 3. They did remember the close encounter with the craft. They did remember observing the non-humans, or what Barney described as being somehow not human. That is a quote.
Okay.
And that was made to Walter Webb, who was from NICAP. He was an astronomer from Massachusetts. He worked at the Hayden Planetarium, and he was the original investigator on the case. He did take a picture during his investigation of Barney standing in the close encounter field, holding binoculars up to his eyes, looking up at that craft. Well, you have to imagine the craft being there based upon what Barney described. But Barney was standing in the field with the binoculars, posing in the position where he was standing for Walter Webb.
Okay. The part where they went down Millbrook Road, you said something about that being a recovered memory after that point, where they stopped down?
After that point, they did not consciously, they knew that they'd gone onto a dirt road. They looked for that dirt road. They started looking in the fall after the encounter. They looked. They underwent hypnosis, and finally they ended up finding the location. But it took quite a long time for them to find that location.
And what was it that they remembered under hypnosis?
Well,
up there on Millbrook.
Yeah, under hypnosis, they recalled that they were seated in the car. The motor had died. There were figures ahead. They were talking to each other. Which is different from what was in Betty's dreams, I might say. And Betty said, "What do you think it is? Is there an accident ahead? Are we being robbed? What's going on here?" And Barney said, as they started to approach, "It's them. It's the ones I saw when I was standing in the field, looking through binoculars at that craft."
And that part is recovered memory. Is that right?
Yes, that part is recovered memory, where they were sitting in the car talking to each other. They did not remember that part of it. Okay.
I'd like to suggest that the reason they didn't remember it was because it didn't really, in actual fact, happen. Okay. I'm going to suggest that they have confused memories of the entire trip, that the memory of the jack-o'-lantern, the point where their headlights swung across the jack-o'-lantern's billboard, just visible for a second, was a memory that the next day they had. You can bring back memories in a lot of different ways. You can change memories. Changing memory is easy.
I'm very well versed on hypnosis, all of the academic studies that have been done, and I've even become certified so that I would be completely rounded in the use of, and misuse of hypnosis and the weaknesses of hypnosis. That is why I ended up doing a comparative analysis of Betty's and Barney's statements under hypnosis in order to determine whether or not these memories that came out under separate hypnosis, separate sessions with Dr. Simon, where he instilled amnesia and at the end of each session for two reasons. One, so that they could not compare notes. The other, because some of what came out was so traumatic that they could become psychologically damaged by remembering it all at once. So those were the two reasons.
Okay. With all respect, ma'am, I don't believe that you're exactly an unbiased expert in this case. I think that the fact that you are Betty's niece gives you a certain predisposition to believe the literal fact of this abduction. May I refer to a paper I've got here called Hypnosis in the Criminal Case, Facts and Fallacies, Phyllis E. Amabile, J.D., M.D., and Thomas H. Joby, M.D. I'm sure you can find it. It's easy enough. Where we read, an essential distinction exists between the psychological therapies and criminal prosecutions, a distinction which must be understood before meaningful guidelines for admissibility can be established. The historical accuracy of a person's recollections is crucial as evidence in a criminal case, but accuracy is not crucial to the course of therapy. And remember that Betty and Barney were there for therapy, not to create any kind of legal case. Moving back to the paper, the psychodynamic significance of the material is more important in therapy than its correspondence to reality. This distinction raises an important concern. Is information obtained through the hypnotic process reliable? Both experimental and clinical findings point to the conclusion that hypnotic recall cannot be considered factually accurate.
I'll give you that, Jim, and I'm speaking as not only as a retired policeman, but also as a reformed lawyer. Hypnosis has not reached the acceptable stage of proof, and therefore is not admissible in a court of law.
And I agree with that. I agree with that as well. And I have studied forensic hypnosis, which at one point in our history was admissible as evidence in a court of law, but then that ended up being thrown out as well. So I am aware of that. And that was the reason for my comparative analysis of Betty's and Barney's separate statements. You mentioned that I am biased. Well, when I began this study, I did it in an unbiased, very careful manner. And I asked Stanton Friedman to review everything that I had written, all of the opinions that I had formed, in order to determine whether or not what I was saying was accurate and unbiased. And he was impressed by the fact that I was approaching this in an unbiased manner.
Stanton Friedman, could you describe what his background is?
Yes, his background is as a nuclear physicist. He has a master's degree from the University of Chicago.
Okay, but what is his background as far as UFOs and all?
He is the original civilian Roswell researcher. He was also an investigator in the Hill case.
Does he fall more on the true believer side?
No, he falls more on the scientist's side. He's not a true believer. A true believer will believe anything. He is very, very carefully studies the evidence. He specializes in government documents. We've been to archival collections together.
And he
is my co-author on. Pardon me?
He's your co-author, right?
Yes, he's my co-author.
Kathy,
he wrote 2 chapters in Captured.
You mentioned you mentioned physical evidence, and that's something I think that I think might be helpful to you and to Jim. Can you tell us, we can tell the listeners, what physical evidence, if any, had been recovered as a result of this incident, and what analysis had been performed on it, and perhaps share that with Jim, and perhaps if Jim has the opportunity to make some comments on that as to whether or not the evidence goes to prove any point of the experience.
Yes, there was evidence on Betty's dress when she arrived home. It had been in fine condition when she put it on that morning. When she arrived home, there was a 2-inch tear in the stitching at the top of her zipper, which went down the back of her dress. There was a 1-inch tear in the thick zipper fabric. The lining of her dress was torn from waist to hemline, and the hem was torn down on one side. She could think of no prosaic explanation for how that had occurred. She placed the dress in her closet, and the next time she removed it, it was covered with a pink powdery substance. That dress has undergone scientific analysis in 5 separate laboratories.
What were the results of those analyses?
At the University of Cincinnati, they said that the pink powder was strange in relation to the inorganic elemental compound and that it was high in organic hydrocarbons. The Pinelandia Biophysics Laboratory did a bioassay test, and that was seedling growth rates. And they found that the seedlings that were watered with part of the dress that was coated with this pink powdery substance grew at an extraordinarily fast rate, and they wrote in the report that this was highly unusual. The Frontier Analysis Laboratory stated that the chemical analysis supports Betty's account of what happened to the dress. The stained areas were coated with a biological material of mostly protein and a small amount of natural oil. The protein attacked the fiber and dye and the stained areas and broke down the fiber structure, and it came from an external source, not from Betty.
She didn't throw this dress in the trash at any point, did she? Because I believe we read that, at least in some account.
She put it in, and then she took it out immediately, thinking that she should save it in case it held a clue to what had happened.
Okay. I have read, I have no idea if this is true, you can correct me, that the pink powdery substance showed up after the dress had been in her closet for 40 years. Is that correct?
No, that's not true.
Okay. How long had it been in her closet?
She wasn't sure when she actually took it out. Some reports said that it was within a very brief period of time. I wrote in the book, the best that I could determine, she found it on there when she was seeing Dr. Simon a couple of years later.
Okay. Because I've got a Leatherman, those little pocket tools, and I'd left it in its case in a shoebox in the garage, and a year later it had a fine white powder all over it. Just saying.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you that the scientist, one of the scientists who evaluated Betty's dress, had her own dress that was made of the same fabric, and had been in her closet for as many years as Betty's dress had been in the closet. And it did not have any of the characteristics that Betty's dress had.
Yeah, but it wasn't in Betty's closet, so that's really not a good comparison.
Betty's closet. It was in a different closet, but it was the same climate.
Okay.
And I think that the most important thing to me here is the forensic evidence of the tears in the dress. I don't care about what that pink powder was. As far as I know, it was fungus. It could have been
Sounds an awful lot like mold to me.
Yeah, it could have been fungus. It could have been, I'm trying to think of what it's called. Yeast. It could have been yeast. It fluoresced under a black light or under a UV light.
Yeah, so does algae.
Yeah, so, but those, the 5 chemical analyses that were done on that dress said that it was highly unusual.
Okay.
Let me get on to
please.
another piece of evidence. The alien symbols that Betty claimed that she saw when she was on the craft.
A recovered memory, right?
Yes, that was recovered memory.
Okay.
And in the year 2000, she sketched those symbols for me from memory. And I published them in Captured. And Dr. Don C. Donderi, who was a psychology professor at McGill University, in 2004 did a symbol study. And what he did is he had symbols that were sketched by several experiencers who had gone to see the late researcher Bud Hopkins, and they had sketched these symbols that they had observed on craft under hypnosis. And then they photocopied those all onto the same paper. They had 2 groups of graduate students. One was told to imagine what alien symbols would look like and to sketch them. The other group of graduate students was hypnotized, and the suggestion was given that they were on an alien craft and saw symbols. Well, in the end, they found that the symbols from Bud Hopkins experiencers were very, very much alike. And Dr. Donderi then took the symbols that Betty had sketched, and he stated the symbols Betty remembered and that were published for the first time in 2007 look remarkably like many of the symbols that Hopkins had been collecting since 1975.
How weird.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to say that anything recovered under hypnosis can be safely ignored.
Well, hypnosis, and I wrote about this in my book, has been used very, very effectively for a number of things. So of course it is possible for people to confabulate. We all know that. But it has been used very successfully as well. And not just for therapy, but for memory retrieval.
Yes, and in those cases, correct me if I'm wrong, but the testimony of those individuals is no longer admissible. Now, the police may use it to recover a license plate number, but then they must use other investigative techniques to bring that into court.
Yes, you are correct, and that's why I have always stated that I think that the emphasis on this case should be placed upon their conscious, continuous recall of what occurred, and less emphasis placed upon what they said under hypnosis, except for those that I have, where I have done comparative analysis of their statements, and they were the same, but they were different from what Betty had written in about the dreams that she had, which were another thing that came in and was Betty simply reliving a series of dreams she had under hypnosis. And so it becomes very, very complicated as we get into the study of all of this. And that's why it's so important to very, very carefully look at every little piece of evidence. And does it hold up under scrutiny, or do you have to throw that out as not holding up? And I wrote about that in Captured, and I wrote about the information that really did not hold up under scrutiny as well.
Kathy, I'm going to have to say goodnight because I'm going to let other callers call in.
Okay.
But I really
thank you.
appreciate it. And do you have any parting words, either one of you?
Well, I would be very happy to send some of this information to Jim if he would like to have it, if he'd like to have copies of those documents, and perhaps that would help him to determine what happened and when.
Well, I am not a UFO researcher. I'm not a Betty and Bernie Hill expert. I have no opinion about any other event, any other abductions, what may have you. All I know is that what I personally can observe driving down Route 3, the light on Cannon Mountain exactly matches the movement of the UFO as described in Interrupted Journey. That's what I'm saying. And when you say that the craft was light on the top and dark on the bottom, the light back in 61 on the observation tower, fire watch tower on Cannon Mountain, was above the roof, and it illuminated the top of the roof, and the bottom was in shadow. Fact.
Yeah, but you have to. I didn't say it was light on the top and dark on the bottom. I did say that it was rotating and it was hovering beside the old man's profile before it traveled south into Lincoln, a mile south of Indian Head.
I do believe that those memories are false memories.
Well, they knew them the next day.
They knew them the next day.
They knew them the next day. They never forgot about them. And I have faith in human beings that they can remember from one evening to the next morning what had happened to them when they had not slept. Those memories are continuous. They're conscious memories, and I think it's really important. So I'm going to hang up, and I will listen to the next caller. Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot, Kathy. Take care. All right. So the line is open. If anyone else would like to call in, that's 603-967-4030. Jim, have you actually listened to the recordings of Dr. Simon's hypnosis? Have you listened? All right, everyone. So that's it for the free part of the show. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back next week with Nadine Lalich. And remember, you can listen live on YouTube just one more week. That's 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, right on Podcast UFO. Thanks so much. Have a good week. And remember to keep your eyes to the sky.